Well, I hope I've done a fair job in outlining at least part of the argument so far. And I think that it leads to, in terms of what the new ethics might look like, a new ethics that corresponds to our new situation that Jonas is claiming modern technology has created for us, leads to a certain conclusion about how we look at the kind of large scale things, the large scale decisions that we make. I think it is suggested in this quote here, where he says knowledge, and that means practical knowledge, knowledge of what will happen if we do something. What will the effects be? Thinking through that anticipation of consequences that, say, utilitarianism asks us to do. Knowledge under these circumstances becomes a prime duty beyond anything claimed for it heretofore, and the knowledge must be commensurate with the causal scale of our action. That, I think, is the key point. That is, that our knowledge of effects must be, the certainty of that knowledge, the extent of that knowledge must be commensurate with the power of the action. And what he says immediately is the fact that it cannot really be thus commensurate. That is, that the predictive knowledge falls behind the technical knowledge, which nourishes our power to act, itself assumes ethical importance. That is key, because what he's talking about is unintended consequences. Human actions have always had unintended consequences all through history. People have done things without really knowing what the effects ultimately of their actions will be. And that has always been a factor in human ethical life, but now it's more of a factor because those consequences now have the potential to be so widespread and lasting. The more power, the more responsibility, basically. The more power our actions have to change the conditions of human life, maybe even change humanity itself, socially, genetically, the more the so-called imperative of responsibility that Jonas comes out with comes to the fore. To act with great power without some knowledge of the effects of that actions is irresponsible. So the only responsible way of acting when it comes to these big technological decisions, like handing over our decision-making process to a computer, or later on with the idea of the singularity, the idea of creating a true artificial intelligence that some will think will quickly become a super intelligence, that before we could do those things responsibly, we would have to really know what the effects are. And he says immediately that we cannot know. We cannot have the kind of commensurate knowledge. We can speculate about what the effects will be, but we really don't know. I think that probably is obviously correct in some respects. For instance, take the establishment of the internet. At least the internet that I know, which was really established in the early 90s. No one could have drawn a line from the establishment of the World Wide Web to, let's say, the election of 2016, where a foreign power interfered with American elections through social media. I'm not saying that's the worst thing that's ever happened, but it was something that was enabled and is part of our world now as a result of the internet and creation of social media, influencing foreign elections in a very sort of economic way, a very cheap way, through fiddling with people's social media feeds. No one could have anticipated that when the internet got started. No one could have even anticipated social media. When the internet got started in America, at least back in the early 90s, it was more or less seen as a universal library, as a repository of information. People weren't thinking of it in an interactive way. That really came later. People weren't thinking of internet commerce, really, as far as I can remember. People had a notion of the internet that fit their idea of reality at that time. Al Gore in the early 90s liked to call it the information superhighway with an emphasis on information. He had no idea, obviously, of the real power of interactive social media, its effects on the economy, its effects on news, the way that people, I mean, it was all really unpredictable at the time, yet we sort of went ahead and did it, right? This is Jonas's point, is that we can't just go ahead and do it. And maybe that's really takes us to uh, the last real the big, I would say, the big message here, and that is humility. It's just kind of how he ends it, I think, where he says, if the new nature of our acting then calls for a new ethics of long range responsibility, that is, we no longer have to think just about the here and now effects of our actions. We have to think about the long range, how the things that we do will change the conditions of human life forever. That this calls for a humility, and that humility is the humility of being aware that we are not, that we, knowing that we don't know, okay? Knowing that however carefully we try to think through the consequences of our big decisions here, that we cannot really know. We cannot really anticipate all the effects. So the only reasonable attitude is an attitude of humility, that is a recognition of our ignorance, a recognition that there will most likely be entirely unattended effects of our big decisions. If we think of something that is fairly well defined or limited, something like the introduction of autopilot, of self driving cars, um, there are all sorts of good reasons to introduce self driving cars. I think on a utilitarian basis, as many of you said, if they're safer, why not do it? And they no doubt will have positive effects, but do we really know ultimately, considering how big a change that will be, what other effects they may have? Can we really think it through entirely to make a responsible decision? I don't know. But he says, if the new nature of our acting then calls for a new ethics of long range responsibility, coextensive with the range of our power, it calls in the name of that very responsibility also for a new kind of humility, a humility not like former humility, that is, owing to the littleness, but owing to the excessive magnitude of our power, which is the excess of our power to act over our power to foresee and our power to evaluate and to judge. Basically saying that our technological power is so much greater than our knowledge of effects, and so much greater perhaps than the resources of our ethics, that something like a humility, and I would say what goes along with that, a carefulness and restraint, is called for. So it may be, for instance, that Jonas is saying that on traditional utilitarian grounds, the introduction of autopilot is a no-brainer. Of course we want autopilot because computers will be better, no doubt, at driving than human beings. It will reduce accidents. It will reduce human suffering as a result of driving cars. Of course it will. But if we were to be really humble about it, to exercise that humility, we would also have to admit that we, along with those positive consequences, there may be negative ones that we can't foresee. Um, yeah. So it leads us into a very difficult situation, especially those of you who are, I don't know, computer engineers, or in some way or another will be working on technology in your professional lives in one way or another. It presents a very difficult dilemma, because on the one hand, as people who work with technology, you want to move technological progress ahead, and that's completely natural and defensible. On the other hand, you live in a world where the unintended consequences of technological progress force you to be very thoughtful about that. You know, I mean, innovators of the Industrial Revolution had no idea of greenhouse gases, right? I mean, when we started digging up all that coal and burning all that oil, no one had any idea. No one even knew about, I mean, some people did. Very, very few people did. Once they understood how the greenhouse effect worked in terms of the life on Earth, they understood that if you put more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, you will have a warming planet. But that was, almost unknown. Pushing forward the burning of fossil fuels seemed like nothing but positive for the human species in terms of improving its life. And there are all sorts of improvements, of course. But they did not and could not anticipate something like global warming. They just couldn't do it. So what Jonas, I think, ultimately is saying is that our ancestors, that we can forgive them for their recklessness because they didn't have the scope that we do in terms of understanding the long-term effects our actions will have and the necessary uncertainty that we have in terms of judging what those long-term effects will be. That we can forgive our ancestors for being reckless, but we can't forgive ourselves. We can't forgive ourselves. If we think of something like the creation of nuclear weapons, which happened in America during World War II, if you look at interviews with the physicists and engineers who built the first atomic weapons, they were wonderful people by and large. But they had no concept until after those weapons had been used that they were changing the world forever. They didn't realize that the introduction of nuclear weapons would qualitatively change human history for all time. And one can sort of look back and say, well, they should have. They should have known that they weren't just making a more effective weapon to win the war, that they were changing the course of human history for ill or for good. At this point, we really can't deny that. And so as we move into further weeks of the course and start talking about especially the singularity, which would be the ultimate changing the future forever in ways that we cannot anticipate, and which really touch on some of the other things that Jonas says about the limits of human life. For instance, if you look at writing about the singularity, there are all sorts of issues, but one of the issues is that a superintelligence, the creation of which, or the emergence of which, would constitute the singularity, might change human life in all sorts of ways, especially in terms of human nature. That is, there are some people who anticipate that a superintelligence would be so intelligent that it could solve all sorts of problems of human life, including biological problems of the limits of human intelligence, the limits of human physical abilities, and the limits of the human lifespan in terms of mortality. That is, the creation of a superintelligence, some may say, others say it's still science fiction, or merely science fiction. But the creation of a superintelligence may cure death. It may extend the human lifespan indefinitely, which is just the sort of thing Jonas focuses on, how terrible that might be. I mean, he's against it, right? Let's see. For instance, here he says, regardless of the question of compulsion or consent, and regardless also of the question of undesirable side effects, each time we thus bypass the human way of dealing with human problems, short-circuiting it by an impersonal mechanism, we have taken away something from the dignity of personal selfhood and advanced a further step on the road from responsible subjects to programmed behavior system. Again, I always qualify any discussion of sincerity by saying it could all be nonsense. But if we take it seriously, as these philosophers and their respectable philosophers do, this is just the sort of nightmare that Jonas is having, is that because the idea is that a superintelligence would pretty much run the show as far as the future of human civilization, human life on this planet, because it would be so much better at addressing not only technological problems, but also social, ethical, political problems, that we would have kind of no choice but to hand over our autonomy to that superintelligence, which is exactly the ultimate nightmare, yes, that Jonas is having here. So I think that we're left with a very troubling and challenging thesis, and that is that we have to be extremely careful and extremely conservative in the kind of decisions we make in terms of instituting technological changes, considering the power of our technology. That is not an easy thesis to deal with. To accept the Jonas thesis may be to accept a stunting of human technological development, which most people just would reject out of hand. I don't know.